how our roles, time, and power shaped what we lived and what we saw. There's a strange thing about being in a high-control group like Scientology, especially being raised in it. Even though we were all part of the same system, what we experienced could look and feel entirely different depending on our role, how long we were there, and how much power we had or didn't have. And here's the wild part. None of those perspectives cancels out the other. Imagine Scientology as this giant oppressive machine. Some of us were the gears, grinding endlessly to keep it running. Others were trapped inside, getting crushed. And a few of us, for a time, might have sat at the controls, enforcing rules we didn't even fully understand. Same system, radically different perspectives. A kid born into the Sea Org, or one forced to sign their billion-year contract at 9 years old, or even just a kid developing while being bottle-fed Scientology with no free will to choose something else. Their experience of freedom and choice isn't going to look anything like that of someone who joined as an adult and had the illusion of opting in. Someone in a position of relative power, say an exec, or even a public-paying member with more freedoms, might have felt like they had some control, even if they were still trapped by the system. Meanwhile, those on the receiving end of that power felt the full weight of control bearing down on them. And here's the kicker. All of those experiences are valid. The length of time you spent in Scientology also colors everything. If you were born or raised in, it was your entire world. You didn't know there was another way to live. You may have never even imagined a world without security checks, knowledge reports, or the fear of being declared suppressive. If you joined as an adult, you likely had a before life. Maybe you missed it, or maybe you were running from it. Either way, you had something to compare your experience to. If you escaped early, you might feel lucky you got out, but also haunted by what could have happened if you hadn't. If you stayed longer, you might wrestle with guilt about the harm you contributed to while you were still inside. The machine treats everyone differently, and the longer you're part of it, the deeper the scars. Power within the Sea Org is a tricky thing, and it provides different perspectives. Maybe you were one of the kids scrubbing toilets at 3 a.m. after being assigned lower conditions, forced to make up crimes from your past lives to explain what you did to deserve this. Maybe you were the ethics officer handing out those punishments, believing you were helping people correct themselves, saving them. Or maybe you were a parent, torn between loyalty to the group and the quiet, gnawing guilt of watching your child endure things you wouldn't wish on anyone. Each of these roles shapes what you saw and how you experience the system. The kid sees abuse. The ethics officer sees discipline. The parent sees impossible choices. Same event, 3 sides. How could we experience it all so differently? Because Scientology's strength as a system of control lies in its ability to create individualized cages. If you were a child, your cage was built of obedience and fear, reinforced by the belief that you were an ageless spirit in a small body and didn't deserve special treatment. If you were an adult member, your cage was built of guilt and duty, convincing you that sacrificing everything for the greatest good made you noble. If you had a position of authority, your cage was built of loyalty and paranoia, keeping you compliant by making you fear the same system you enforced. Different cages, same prison. Why do we often collide over perspective? Great question. Here's where it gets complicated. Once we escape, our perspectives don't always align. Someone who spent years in the Sea Org might feel resentment toward public Scientologists who never endured the same level of control or sacrifice. A public member might feel dismissed or invalidated because their trauma doesn't compare. Someone who held power might struggle with guilt, combined with trauma, while others hold anger toward them for the role they played while ignoring their suffering. And all of this? It's real. The pain of the kids sent to the RPF is real. The shame of the person who enforced the RPF rules is real. The guilt of the parent who stood by and stayed silent is real. How can we hold space for the 3 sides? Well, it can be tricky. When we share our stories, it's tempting to focus only on our own lens. But healing comes when we acknowledge the other sides too, not as competition, but as part of the whole picture. Here's how we can navigate this together. Validate every perspective. Just because someone's experience was different doesn't mean it's less valid. Recognize your own bias. Your role shaped what you saw and what you felt. But it's only one piece of the puzzle. Try to separate the person from the system. The person enforcing the rules was often as trapped as the person suffering under them. Blame the system, not just the individual. Be patient with each other. It's hard to hear a perspective that contradicts or complicates your own. But listening doesn't invalidate what you went through. It just adds depth to the story. Will we clash? You bet. I'll never forget the first time I argued with another ex-Scientologist about whether we were human trafficked. I finally realized we had been, and I was ready to fight. I knew what I'd endured. But their argument? They had been in a more powerful position, one that gave them privileges I couldn't even imagine. They didn't feel trafficked, even though the system ultimately used them just the same. They even accused me of exaggerating. That conversation taught me something big. Our experiences are never going to line up perfectly, but that doesn't mean they don't all matter. My takeaway? The system we survived was designed to divide us, even after we've left. It relied on isolation, control, and hierarchy to pit us against each other. But the truth is, we're all survivors of the same machine. And while our experiences might look wildly different, they all lead back to the same root. Our pain isn't a competition. Our stories aren't in opposition. They're just different sides of the same coin. By holding space for all three sides, your side, their side, and the messy truth in between, we can begin to heal together.